I'm Marianne Feeney, Director of Events at the International Peace Institute. It's a pleasure to welcome you here tonight to this important event organized under IPI's Women, Peace, and Security event series. It's an honor to be hosting this event organized in partnership with the United Nations Development Program and UN Women. IPI's Women, Peace, and Security event series is a collaborative effort to highlight the work of women advancing peace processes and also to create a space for important presentations and discussions about efforts to protect women in conflict and post-conflict situations and support their roles in the practices of peacekeeping and peace building. Since the year 2000, there have been 7 UN Security Council resolutions on women, peace, and security, and 4 Security Council resolutions specifically focused on conflict-related sexual violence. And last year, the UN Security Council passed Resolution 2106 that added greater operational detail to previous resolutions on sexual violence and reiterated that all actors, not just the Security Council and parties to armed conflict, but all member states and UN entities must do more to implement previous mandates and combat impunities for these crimes. Conflict-related sexual violence has gained increasing amounts of international attention, fueled by the sharing of survivor experiences and also increasing reference to these crimes in international courts and tribunals. However, lack of resources and impunity still stand in the way of justice. Reports have shown, including a report issued by the UN Secretary General in 2012, that sexual violence threatens security and impedes peace building in post-conflict situations. Sexual violence has also been used in the context of elections, political strife, and civil unrest in countries such as Egypt, Kenya, and Syria, among others. We're very fortunate tonight to have a distinguished panel of experts here with us who are working on addressing and combating these atrocities. We look forward to learning from their experiences and to hearing their recommendations on how to improve both prevention and response. Tonight's discussion will be chaired by Dr. Anne-Marie Getz. Dr. Getz is a clinical professor with the Center for Global Affairs at NYU. She's currently on leave from UN Women, where she served as the chief advisor of the Peace and Security section for the past 8 years. Prior to joining UN Women, she was a professor of political science at the University of Sussex. She's published extensively on topics such as gender and conflict, as well as state building in fragile states and post-conflict situations, among other subjects. She's the author of 6 books that focus on gender and politics in developing countries, and it's a real privilege to have her here with us tonight. Before I begin, may I ask that everyone please silence their phones. Thank you very much. Anne-Marie, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much to IPI for hosting this event. And I remember that part of your series on women in conflict included, not too long ago, another one that was justice themed when you brought, quite unusually, all 4 principals of the Sierra Leone Special Court here, all of whom, in an unprecedented fashion, were female. For the first time, I think, ever in the international tribunals of the world. All of you who are standing, I'm sorry. Could anybody who has an empty seat next to them put up their hand? And please do come forward if you'd like to be comfortable. And those of you, I see no movement, so let's do that again. Hands up. Please, if you'd like to be comfortable, and if you're at the back because you have to sneak out, that's okay. But if you don't have to, come forward and we'll make you comfortable. And when you sit down, you will notice on your chair this fantastic report, UNDP, UN Women, Improving Women's Access to Justice During and After Conflict, which is being relaunched today because it's produced so beautifully, and we can't resist, bringing it to broader audiences. And this is one feature, as you will hear eventually in tonight's panel, of the cooperation between UNDP and UN Women. Our event today will be closed by Mr. Jordan Ryan, who is sitting here at ASG on conflict prevention and recovery, and of course a very important sponsor of this work. Anne Jones, who's a journalist who works a lot on conflict in West Africa, wrote a book called The War Isn't Over When It's Over, about women's experiences of conflict and post-conflict. And she, of course, drew attention to the fact that sexual violence continues at elevated levels after conflict, as do many other abuses against women, partly because of impunity and many other reasons that we'll be hearing about today. It's critical that both during conflict and after conflict, for human rights and for recovery reasons, that the issue of justice for women is addressed as a priority of the UN system. We'll be hearing tonight from 4 panelists, and we're very lucky to have them all. And I'm going to introduce each one before they speak. And surprise news to the panel, we're changing the order of speakers slightly. So Nala is going to go last instead of, wait a minute, are you going last or before Erin? Last, before Erin, after Erin. So I hope that doesn't horrify anybody. And the purpose of the interventions is going to be to hear about the challenges faced by women and girls seeking justice during and after conflict, and some extraordinary good practices and innovations. And who better to tell us about these than the Master and Registrar of the Sierra Leone Judiciary, and I've just lost my bios. Luckily, you all have them on your chair in case I miss anything out. Madam Julia Sarkodie-Mensah, who since 2006 has been working to support justice sector reform in Sierra Leone. Her bio is long and detailed and includes her work as an honorary consul as well of Ghana in Botswana. But she's going to be talking in particular about innovations in Sierra Leone, where she's been helping to rebuild and ensure access to justice in the country. She's responsible for the judicial and legal administration of all courts, from magistrates' courts to the Supreme Court. She is also the judiciary's focal point with donors and other external partners. And interesting for those of you who were here for the Sierra Leone Special Court discussion, she's also on the Legacy Working Group and the Legacy Capacity Building Committee of that court. We are absolutely delighted to have you here. I understand it's been a long day, and we're going to hear from you about your innovations in Sierra Leone.
We've been at it since morning, but this is a topic which is really on my heart, and I don't mind you having me to repeat it every day, as long as I have an audience. So some of the things, or most of the things, those of us who were in the meeting this morning may have heard, but I think this is a different audience with few other people. So forgive me if I am repeating what I said, but I try to go a little bit from a different angle. I wouldn't bore you with all the background, but just to tell you where Sierra Leone is coming from and where we are at the moment as far as access to justice, especially for women, is concerned. For many years, Sierra Leone was ranked by the Human Development Index as the least developed country in the world. This is now changing, and with improvement, of course, comes the inherent challenges, especially in the criminal justice system and access to justice. However, poverty and illiteracy levels still remain very high in Sierra Leone. And when the situation is like that, who suffers most but women? And this has been really taken to a higher level because of the 11 years brutal war in Sierra Leone. We went through civil strife from 1991 to 2002. And I must say it was very brutal. And some of you may have read about it, you've seen the films, but that's exactly what happened. And it was alleged that one of the main causes of the war was breakdown of law and order in Sierra Leone. There was a complete destruction of the rule of law. People did not have access to justice. They felt cheated, and they decided to take the law into their hands, coupled with other causes. This is also important to mention that Sierra Leone is a signatory to many international conventions, including CEDAW, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the Protocol on the Sale of Children, Child Prostitution and Child Pornography, the African Charter of Human and People's Rights. Notwithstanding, there are very deep-seated traditions in Sierra Leone that mitigate against women and children. The traditional values make it very difficult for women to speak and for women to access justice, especially in rural areas. Things like domestic violence, wife battering, and sexual abuse are still considered normal in some societies. And many women and girls, especially in the rural areas, suffer in silence with no voice nor visibility. It is even considered an abomination and domestic treachery for a woman suffering violence to report, whether it's her husband or her partner or whoever. And it is interesting to note that often sexual violence on these women is committed by people very close to them, their uncles, their fathers, sometimes biological fathers, and you cannot talk so much about it because it is treachery. You bring shame to the family. Unfortunately, most people are either ignorant or could not care about the long-term psychological and physical effects on the victims, as it negatively impacts on the human resource of the nation and the economy generally. So that is why we have to tackle sexual violence. It is believed that almost every family in Sierra Leone has experienced sexual violence, one way or the other, one member in the family. Wife and child battering is in one form or the other. Unfortunately, in such situations, the victims are regarded as a shame and a disgrace. The 11-year was, as I said, deepening the plight of the women and girls vis-a-vis sexual violence and gender justice. Many women and girls were abducted during the war. They were brutalized, they were raped and dehumanized, and others were forced to become combatants. They were impregnated and underwent forced and brutal abortions, deliberate abortions. And others were forced into marriage to the rebels who treated them like sex slaves and bushwives. Sadly, some women and girls felt lucky to be forced into sexual enslavement to an individual combatant, escaping group sex. Such violence, in many instances, is also extended to the family. Because instead of becoming a common wife to a lot of rebels, you found yourself lucky if you were only abducted by one person and he kept you as a bushwife. Otherwise, the gang rape was the order of the day. Rape and sexual violence were in all forms used as weapons of war. And this is why the landmark decision of the Special Court of Sierra Leone declaring rape and forced marriage as a weapon of war is celebrated. It was a great relief and a major milestone in the jurisprudence and legal landscape of Sierra Leone when in March 2009, the trial chamber of the Special Court for Sierra Leone delivered that judgment where they declared that forced marriage is a crime against humanity. This judgment was the first ever conviction in an international tribunal whereby sexual slavery and forced marriage were held to be crimes against humanity. And happily, in the same year, October, the convictions were upheld by the appeals chamber. And so this is now part of our jurisprudence. Because in this judgment, the court found that the RUF, the rebels, used the term wife to forcefully enslave and psychologically manipulate civilian women and girls. It recognized that the act of forced marriage entails rape, sexual slavery, and other sexual violence used as weapons by the rebels. So post-war, Sierra Leone had to embark on reforms. And as part of the reforms, the 3 Gender Acts were enacted in 2007. And these gender acts were the Domestic Violence Act, the Devolution of Estates Act, the Registration of Customary Marriages Act, and in 2012, the Sexual Offences Act. The Domestic Violence Act criminalized all forms of domestic violence, such as rape, so we have marital rape as part of our law, torture, wife battering, emotional violence, economic deprivation, and provides protection for victims of domestic violence, sexual and other forms of harassment in the domestic setting. Then the Devolution of Estates Act providing for surviving spouse, and the Marriage and Divorce Act provides for registration of customary marriage. This is improving the legal status generally of women. Our reforms really took off properly in 2005 when we started to restructure the judiciary and put measures in place to combat SGBVs. This is in line with the declared vision of the justice sector of Sierra Leone to have improved safety and security and access to justice for all, and principally women. Our response to the SGBV is to institute the Special Gender Violence Saturday Courts. With funding from the United Nations Development Programme, the theme and main objective of this initiative is to make the invisible visible and end impunity and stigma. Because as I said, a lot of women suffer quietly, they have no voice, and they cannot be seen. But with this project, it is changing the landscape. GBV is experienced by those who are less able to defend themselves and who, because of poverty, deprivation, stigma, cultural and traditional norms and practices, remain voiceless, invisible, and stigmatized. The special gender-based violence courts were formally launched in February 2011. What we did, we selected some high courts because we cannot do it countrywide. So we started with some high courts, one high court in Freetown, one high court in another town in the East called Kenema. And also we selected some magistrates courts. And what they do is they sit every Saturday the whole day. And these sittings are in addition to the normal sittings which happen during the week. And in practice, gender violence cases are not to be adjourned for long periods. Because we have a problem in Sierra Leone, we have very few judges and very few magistrates. A population of 6 million, we have 25 magistrates, and we have 22 judges, because we are unable to attract people onto the bench because the conditions are such that it is not attractive. People rather remain in private practice. So because of that, we only have to make do with what we have. And as a result, in the normal justice system, you find that the cases get adjourned because we don't have enough staff. So we try to change it with the GBV cases to make sure they don't get adjourned. We encourage the magistrates and the judges, and then they have to sit on Saturdays in addition to the normal sittings. This is to improve the access to justice to women and to give them a voice and to end the stigma. It was conceptualized that as we handle the SGBVs, we also handle matters involving women, that especially matters arising out of the Domestic Violence Act, the Devolution of Estates Act, and the Registration of Customary Acts, because those are all related. Sitting on Saturdays provide additional privacy to victims and witnesses, because the courts are normally quiet on Saturdays, so there's more privacy for them, and more people are able to come out. Those who would not want to come to court, they know that Saturdays, it's quiet, and there's more privacy. It also ensures that child victims and child witnesses, who are often the main victims, do not have to take time out of school, because Saturdays they don't go to school, so they can come to court and testify. Because previously, children would not come to testify because they were prevented by their parents. But now the parents themselves realize that Saturdays is quiet, so they do come. It also ensures swift disposal of these cases, because sometimes on a Saturday, a magistrate or a judge is able to take all the witnesses, whereas in other cases, because of the caseload, he may take one witness and then adjourn the case to another time. But it doesn't happen normally with GBV cases. And as a matter of policy, even though we know some human rights activists may object to it, in sexual gender-based violence cases, apart from fast-tracking it, it is a policy that in the initial stages we do not grant bail. Although bail is provided in the Act, it's a policy, because normally when you grant bail to the perpetrator, he does not come back to court, because in the interim, the families have met and they have compromised. And they've paid each other some money, and then they relocate even the accused person, and they relocate the victim, so the cases are aborted. And that's why we now make a policy not to grant bail. And again, as a matter of policy, although every year we have an amnesty committee chaired by our vice president to grant amnesty to people in prison, again, as a matter of policy, we do not grant amnesty to people who are convicted of GBVs, because we want to send the message quite clear that it is not to be tolerated. In terms of our Criminal Procedure Act, prior to 2011, we had very few cases coming, and when they come, they took about 36 months to complete. But since 2012, when we started this special courts, they take less than 35 days, up to 35 days or more. Somebody talked earlier about what we should do as far as prevention is concerned. It takes a lot of public education and awareness to let the women know that they have to speak out, and for them to gain confidence in the judicial system, for them to know that when they come to court, they are not going to say, come back tomorrow and come back tomorrow. But apart from that, we try to work together as a sector for public education. So the judiciary meets together with the police, and then there's a wing in the police called the Family Support Unit who send the message across. We work together with the Ministry of Social Welfare. We make sure there are probation officers also taking the message across. The other thing is we name and shame, especially when they are high-profile cases. It's important to name and shame, and we publicize some of these cases. We withhold names, of course, but we publicize them for people to know that the end of impunity is coming. And I gave an example this morning of a minister of state who was charged with rape. And in the olden times, it would have been swept under the carpet, but he was charged. He lost his job and he's before court at the moment. The case is still ongoing, so we don't discuss it. I gave an example of a big chief who impregnated a 13-year-old girl, and the family made the chief to marry the girl. And this is against the Child Rights Act in Sierra Leone, because you cannot marry under the age of 18. And the girl was only 13. And it is an offense. So when the thing came out, we publicized it. It was all over. And the chief lost his job. He was charged. He was convicted. The marriage was annulled. And it was publicized. So these are the kind of steps we take to make sure people get to know that no more is no more to be tolerated. With the support of the UNDP, again, we put a lot of strategies in place which made people to come forward. Previously, a lot of witnesses would not come because they were afraid and they did not have the means even to come to court. So with a witness support fund, we give people enough money for transport, and they do come to court, and they realize that this is the right thing now to do. Again, a lot of time matters are adjourned because the accused persons may not have lawyers, and if there are no lawyers, the judges may not proceed. So we put a fund in place for defense counsels to be provided for even for the accused persons, just for the cases to proceed and justice to be done. I will say that the projects have made a lot of impact on the landscape, although there are more and more cases coming up. And what we say is that before we didn't have the cases because people were quiet. And now more and more people are coming. So the volume of SGBV cases have gone really high. And that's why we need to have more support. And we now want to upscale the project to go out of the 3 towns which we chose to go to other places, because studies have shown that there are an increase in a lot of the other towns in the rural areas. So we're going to upscale it, funds permitting. And I wanted to point out that during 2013, the selected courts disposed of up to 90% of all the cases which came before them. Previously, the rate of disposal was about 30%. So that shows you that the special GBV courts and the project is making a big impact on our community. But there are a lot of challenges, and there are recommendations which have to be made. Some of the challenges and recommendations are with more awareness and sensitization programs. We need witness protection and child witnesses to be protected. We need screening facilities because sometimes when especially the children, when they face the accused persons with the body language and everything, they change their stories. We have cases where the accused will identify, the child victim will identify the accused. But when she comes to court, she's facing the accused right in court, even though this is done in chambers, not in open court, but the accused is there, and maybe the family members. She changes her story. A girl comes, she was raped by her uncle, she was pregnant, 13-year-old girl. When she was, she said, this uncle. But when she came to court, she changed her story because when she went home, they said, you don't go and say it's the uncle. She said, I don't know who impregnated me. So we need more programs to, first of all, educate the girls and also protect them and give screening facilities. We need to train more of our probation officers. And unfortunately, in Sierra Leone, we don't have forensic analysts. And sometimes these delay the cases. And for a country of 6 million, we have 1 pathologist. So we are looking at maybe getting more pathologists, training more forensic analysts in order to make sure these cases go forward. I believe my time is up. So the rest will be coming out in my question time. Sorry. Thank you for listening.
Thank you. I'm sorry. Thank you so much for explaining what you've managed to do with limited resources and the scale of the problem. It's very impressive. And also thank you for mentioning the paradoxical situation where a sign of success is actually increased caseload, increased reporting of sexual and gender-based violence, which is something that will affect all work in this area, including even efforts to address this in the post-2015 framework, that we will see an increase in reporting the more successful we are. And I hope that we will indeed have a chance to come back and ask you more questions about this extraordinary experience. And as I mentioned to you before we started, it would also be interesting to compare Sierra Leone's experience with Liberia's. Both countries have tried very hard to tackle this problem with, I think, different outcomes. Our next speaker is Corina, I'm going to try to say this right, van der Laan. And we're very fortunate to have her here. She's from the Dutch Foreign Ministry. The Netherlands has been a very important supporter of work on women's rights in general for an awfully long time, and on justice in conflict and post-conflict situations, not least through, of course, hosting some of the most important criminal tribunals dealing with war crimes. Since 2012, Corina van der Laan has been the head of the Division for Stabilization and Rule of Law at the Foreign Ministry, where she has the most extraordinary portfolio covering everything: SSR, mine action, small arms and light weapons, community security, rule of law, transitional justice, media in fragile states, state building, governance, and so on, all of which actually have to be brought into the struggle against violence against women. You'll also note from her bio that wherever she's been, an important part is left behind. She's done a lot of work in Sudan and Congo and continues to support orphan children in those countries. So, Corina, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm not an expert, so I'm just a donor diplomat saying something on this topic, although I've been working for many years on 1325, the UN resolution. So very often I was reading reports about sexual violence in East Congo, for instance, and I've met great women like Madame Mensah, and I really feel, touched and overwhelmed when I hear about those problems. And you feel almost like powerless or desperate. What can we do? The scale is so enormous. As you said, Madame Mensah, every family in Sierra Leone in one way or another has been affected. And I think that in the places where I've been in Sudan and Congo, it's a very similar case. The good news is that there is a bit more political attention for this. Nowadays it's very common for the ministers of foreign affairs to talk about combating sexual violence. Even our minister, Frans Timmermans, he's going to London very soon to talk about the same topic. It's really high on his agenda. And also a bit of positive news, we have UNDP, UN Women, other organizations dealing with this. I read the annual report. Please read it. So I read, for instance, in Burundi, UNDP doing good work, Centra Humura, giving assistance to victims of SGBV, reaching 2,544 persons. So I think that our response However admirable those projects, and Jordan Rying is sitting just here in the first row, however admirable those projects, it's just not good enough. It's just piecemeal. We are not reaching enough people. We are talking about hundreds and thousands of people, women in Burundi, or maybe millions. And we're also talking about millions of women in Sierra Leone and millions again in Congo. And I keep reading about projects. Please forgive me, Jordan, I'm saying this. I keep reading about projects reaching a couple of thousand women. So what can we do? Now, as a donor, we just give money and words of advice, and sometimes we make some provocative statements. I think the answer is twofold. We need to mainstream the combat against sexual violence in every element of peace building. And secondly, we need to do more on prevention. Now, mainstreaming. Okay, I have a budget of about 80 million euro in my division. For each project proposal that lands on my desk, it has to indicate how it contributes to the implementation of UN Resolution 1325. If it doesn't contribute to it, go back to the drawing board. We are talking about mainstreaming, for instance, in peace negotiations. And the gender advisor of the UN Department for Political Affairs told me, sadly enough, in most of the peace negotiations or the ceasefire agreements, sexual violence is not explicitly acknowledged. So it's all about stopping the shooting, but not terminating the sexual violence. So that can continue, women continue to be raped. It's not a violation of the ceasefire. So that is something puzzling. So there we need to do better. Everyone who is involved in those peace negotiations, please. Secondly, security sector reform. A lot of donors have taken on this agenda, including us. In Burundi, we have a long-term program with the armed forces and the police in Burundi. And an integral part of all the training and of all the reforms is gender, is sexual violence. They have recruited officers, female officers in the police, in the armed forces. They have improved oversight mechanisms also to deal with such cases. Because let's face it, armed forces in such countries, they do not only have a role to protect the people, often they are the perpetrators of sexual violence. At least that's how it was during the civil war in Burundi. And related to this, we are also training peacekeepers together with the US AFRICOM, for instance. But also, as I've mentioned, in Burundi, a lot of the Burundian armed forces, they are taking part in MISCA, in AMISOM, in UNAMID, in MINUSMA. So what we do in that training is the pre-deployment training. It's very essential that the combat against sexual violence and gender training is included. Actually, I should not be speaking about this because we have someone in our midst, Patrick Kamart, my tribesman from Holland, General Patrick Kamart. He knows all about this, how to include the combat against sexual violence in pre-deployment training. I hope later he'll get a chance to speak on that. We also need to mainstream sexual violence in the rule of law programs. And there I must say, sorry for my critical words earlier on, Jordan, UNDP has come a long way in improving their gender policies. I see it is now everywhere. DPKO also has a role to play. I think they can do better because it's really part of the protection of civilians. And I think they can do more in ensuring that everyone has the same understanding, a correct understanding of the rules of engagement, about the mandates for protection of civilians. It also includes combating sexual violence. So my second message, actually, if I still have time, prevention. We need to do more in prevention. And I was very much provoked this morning by the Minister of Justice from Congo. She said, prevention in Congo, the best way is to stop the war, to stop the conflict. It's true, I understand where she's coming from, that most of the sexual violence take place in the context of a violent conflict. But even then, prevention is not just you do something before the war or after the war, it's also during the war. We call upon the Congolese government to improve their oversight on the armed forces, to improve military justice. We've just heard the news, was it last week, about the Minova mass rape case where most of the perpetrators have been acquitted. Only few had actually been sentenced. So they need to do better, and I'm sure there's a lot of international partners trying to help them. So prevention is not just in the pre or post-conflict setting, it's also very much during the war. And with these comments, I'd like to stop. Thanks, Annemarie.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Karina. And just as a footnote to follow up on your point on peace negotiations, a study of 300 peace agreements that UNIFEM did years ago. Is Pablo in the room? He's one of the authors. No. It was a study of 300 peace agreements for 45 conflicts between 1989 and 2008, found that sexual violence was mentioned in the agreements for only 10 of these conflicts, 10 out of 45. There were 18 peace accords, so accords written at various points. In those accords, 2 mentioned sexual violence in relation to rule of law and human rights. In 2, it's mentioned in relation to security arrangements. In 2, it's mentioned in relation to DDR. And in only 2 of these peace agreements was it mentioned in relation to the justice chapters. So that has significant implications if you think about the challenges of ensuring that you hit the ground running with prosecutions and with preventive efforts after the conflict. But we certainly take your point that prevention and prosecutions have to happen on the spot as an ongoing process during conflict. So as part of that, one of the most important things we can do is document and be aware of the extent of sexual violence. And I'm delighted that we have with us Erin Gallagher, who currently leads Physicians for Human Rights work on emergency investigations and response during conflict, but has also worked in the recent past, in a very important role as a gender crimes investigator and a human rights investigator for the UN Commission of Inquiry on Libya and on Syria, where she has done extraordinary work highlighting the extent of sexual violence for these commissions of inquiry to make sure that the world is fully aware of what's going on. So we're delighted to have her here, and would also mention, of course, that she's been an important actor on ICTY, where she was an investigator on the cases of the Srebrenica genocide and in 3 genocide trials. So Erin, over to you.
Hi, thank you very much. I come here very much as your practitioner on the ground. I spend a lot of my time speaking to victims, to witnesses, to doctors, psychologists, anyone who will speak to me, basically. So just so you know that that's the lens that I'll be talking through, and focusing primarily on Libya and Syria. That's been the most current work. That's been conflicts that are still in progress, and obviously Syria is still in the throes of it. And I'm going to be speaking really about the work from the front end. Madame Sakori Mensah mentioned that victims not coming forward. And that is certainly one of the biggest obstacles and challenges that we as sexual violence investigators faced in the field with Libya and Syria. It was the lack of victims coming forward. They were reluctant or fearful to speak about the violence. And that goes for men as well. We did have quite a few male victims as well as female victims. And there are a number of reasons for victims not coming forward. Obviously, what's been touched upon, cultural, religious, family factors, which often stigmatize and cast shame upon the individual, upon the family, upon the entire town even. We had a case in Libya, and it was in Misrata, where the town closed down on us, closed down on me, and pressured the victims not to speak with us because they didn't want to be tainted and didn't want to be known as the town where their women had been raped. Women and girls face divorce, face rejection from their families, face destitution for having been raped, for example, in Syria, in prisons. And consequently had a number of cases where young women committed suicide, and just several cases where the family committed an honor killing upon the young woman. So we know the perpetrators may still live in the community, and victims may not trust or may fear the authorities and will not report. The police, military, government may be fragile, may be unequipped, biased, retaliatory, or the perpetrators themselves. There may be local laws that harm the victims, that do not protect them in coming forward. We had cases in Libya where the victims were charged with adultery and sent to social rehabilitation centers for speaking about their rapes. And in several instances where the victims were forced to marry the perpetrator themselves. So there often is not a domestic investigation or prosecution that's happening, as well as an international investigation or prosecution. International authorities can also be untrained, insensitive, or uncommitted. And that goes with investigators, with attorneys, and sometimes, as we know, even with judges. Another challenge that the victims face in terms of seeking justice is the lack of trust and control as to where their story goes. When they tell you their story, what are you going to do with it? Who is going to hear it? They've told you their deepest, darkest secret without knowing where it's going to end up. And in a situation like Syria, we don't even know who the victor is going to be. Will the perpetrators remain in power? And if you speak to an investigator, a human rights defender, journalist, who is looking after the victim's rights, who is protecting the victim, the consequences, as you've heard, can be very severe for the victim, with potentially no benefit or very little benefit. But what's amazing is that you still have victims that do tell their stories. And now there are many more, as we've heard, actors in the field, whether they are investigators, human rights defenders, journalists, that are investigating and documenting sexual violence. Theoretically, this sounds good, but usually it's not in coordination with one another. And many times you are vying and speaking to the same victims, which potentially is causing re-traumatization. It's causing potentially inconsistent statements, which can hurt the credibility of a victim as a witness on the stand. Or simply, it's putting the victims at risk. The different players, actors in the field, all have different agendas, different goals, different skills, different expertise in their speaking with victims. Another challenge, which either prevents a victim from reporting or makes the process more difficult, or possibly easier, is whether the victim has psychological support. In most cases, few do. There is often no safe environment for them to report and to heal. Although UN agencies and international agencies may offer some psychological services, we have often heard the women did not reveal that they had been raped to them. And that's for those that may even have known about the services or the services did exist in that area. Generally, we relied upon Libyan and Syrian intermediaries who may have heard, had suspicions, or knew about some of the victims. There's often no or not enough psychosocial support, medical assistance, legal aid, financial assistance, or protection for a victim. And once again, we are asking a lot from a victim to report and tell his or her story and then not provide any emotional or financial or security net for her. She carries the burden alone from her family, from her friends, from her spouse, or in cases in Syria, in large refugee camps. Which leads me to one of the last major challenges for women and girls. Sexual violence is usually one of many traumatic issues that a victim is dealing with. Victims that we have spoken with have suffered from bombings, shellings, imprisonment, arbitrary arrest, enforced disappearances, torture, beatings. Their family members are missing. They themselves are oftentimes, in Syria, of course, are displaced, either living in camps or living in the urban towns, may have injuries, certainly suffering from trauma, many from PTSD, from depression, from a changing family structure. Now many of the women are the heads of households. Their husbands may be missing, or they're fighting in Syria. So they are experiencing many, many, many different issues in addition to sexual violence. And I've had several victims say to me that the actual rape was the least of their sufferings. These are all very complex issues and they don't easily resolve, especially issues around shame and stigma. We're in the flux still of the crisis. Programs are emerging. I haven't seen a lot of successful programs, but I have seen what I think are the ingredients for success, which includes broad, multidisciplinary, holistic programs or centers which don't isolate or expose or further stigmatize victims, and which partner with local practitioners. And programs that need to be sustained. These are not for victims to come forward. It takes time, it takes trust. It's not going to take investigators coming in and spending a few months, half a year, doing these investigations. These need to be sustained, invested programs. And I don't think they're ever going to come forward in these contexts, in floods. They will come when victims are ready, when they feel safe, when they can trust someone, and when there is a benefit to do so. It is only now that we're starting to see, with Physicians for Human Rights, we train doctors on documenting sexual violence and torture. Been doing that for about a year, and we're now starting to hear those stories. And that's with victims telling Syrian doctors. When many of their urgent needs can be addressed, their safety, medical, psychological, financial, legal needs, only then they might report more. And it's very difficult to separate out the needs due to sexual violence with the needs due to displacement, conflict, trauma, living in a camp, the others that I mentioned. So the successful programs, I think, are the ones that are going to address the multitude of needs. Programs that allow a victim to visit an organization and not stand out as a victim of sexual violence, which prevent further stigmatization. Ideally, it would be a center where they can get medical help, psychological support, legal aid, financial aid at the same time. And if there's a victim with an acute need, then a safe shelter for her and her children. And as we're seeing, especially in Syria, with the stress of living in camps, of being displaced, other violence is also emerging: domestic violence, family violence, physical abuse, and those should also be addressed in such a program. I just want to cite a couple programs that I think have a lot of potential and that are not ideal, but have some of the ingredients of being successful and are doing some very good work. In Aleppo and Damascus, there's a program set up that houses women and girls who have been raped. It's described on the outside as a home for women who have lost their families and lost their spouses. The organization provides apartments, provides doctors that visit, psychologists that visit, as well as programs such as sewing and making soap, actually, so the women and girls can make a living. Another program, in theory, that was good was in Libya, in Benghazi. It was a multidisciplinary unit that hired doctors, psychologists, social workers, lawyers, and provided safe houses for families and for victims. And it was, though unfortunately the organization did not have funding, had very little funding, and was not able to continue the work. But I think it is in these models that can provide the important integrated empowerment and aid that victims need, and then the stories will start to come. So I firmly believe that it is this process that actually will lead eventually to justice. It has to start with the stories being told first, the trust that begins with such a support and empowerment to the victims, and investing in such programs for justice to later come down the road. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Erin. I can't stress enough how important your work is. And the next speaker, Nala Valji, will kill me if I don't mention that Erin's work on these two commissions of inquiry is actually part of a whole pattern that UN Women started on after the awful stadium rapes and massacres of September 28th, 2009 in Guinea-Conakry. When an international commission of inquiry was appointed by the Secretary General, when we thought, why isn't it automatic that a gender crimes investigator is on these commissions of inquiry? So from that point onwards, on every single international commission of inquiry, UN Women has sent a sexual violence or a gender crimes investigator or a gender advisor. And this may sound like a very mundane and prosaic point, but the challenges of finding the right person immediately who can move and join these commissions are extraordinary from an administrative point of view, and they show you a lot about how the UN system has to change to respond, just one of the elements of change needed to respond rapidly when these things occur. People like Erin are not a dime a dozen, she's an absolute diamond, and finding people like her is very difficult, and so for that reason, UN Women started an international training program on sexual violence investigations that Nala may speak about, but I just wanted to raise those two things because the author of both of these initiatives, the secondment of gender crimes investigators and this extraordinary gender training program, is indeed Nala Valji, who is the acting director of the Peace and Security section at UN Women and has a long history, in fact, in transitional justice. She's the co-founder and managing editor of the International Journal of Transitional Justice that I'm sure you're familiar with. And prior to joining the UN, Nala worked as senior project manager in the Transitional Justice Program at the Center for the Study of Violence and Reconciliation in Cape Town, South Africa, where she managed the African Transitional Justice Network. And that sentence is way too long for me to continue with it. But we're really pleased that you can join us and talk about, set all of this into context.
Thank you very much, Anne-Marie. I'd like to start by thanking IPI for hosting us here tonight, to my eminent fellow panelists and moderator, and in particular to UNDP for co-hosting this event with us, and for the incredible partnership that we've had over the years in this particular area. I'm very conscious of the fact that we're running out of time and do want to leave time for discussion and questions and answers, so I'm going to keep my remarks very brief this evening and want to just hit on 3 points. And the first is to follow Karina's lead and put this issue within a broader context in the UN Peace and Security agenda and our efforts with regards to conflict-affected countries. The second is to speak a little bit to the mapping report, which you all have in front of you. And the third is to end speaking a little bit about UN Women's efforts in this area, as Anne-Marie has mentioned already. But I want to start by speaking about the fact that women's access to justice in conflict settings is an area of particular importance for UN Women. And it has been since our creation in 2011. And in fact, in UN Women's first year, our flagship report, Progress of the World's Women, was focused specifically on this issue, on women's access to justice, with a focus within it on access to justice in conflict-affected settings. And the reason for that is that there's a clear understanding and belief and recognition that women's access to justice, in particular in conflict-affected settings, underpins the women, peace, and many areas of the women, peace, and security agenda. The ability to participate in post-conflict recovery, in economic recovery, in leadership, in peace processes, is underpinned by justice and security. In 2011, the World Bank issued their World Development Report that year and focused on the issues of justice, security, and development, talking about how if we are not looking at the three interlinkages between justice, security, and development, if we're not focusing on responding to all three areas in conflict settings, that we will not achieve our goals in terms of post-conflict recovery. And I think that there's nowhere that these linkages are starker or clearer than when we look at conflict settings through a gender lens. As has already been mentioned by fellow panelists, for women, the experience of violence and insecurity continues post-conflict, often at levels that is equal to what they were during the conflict, sometimes at levels that are, in fact, even more elevated than they were during the conflict. And this violence and insecurity is facilitated by the breakdown of justice systems, of rule of law, and by widespread impunity for past as well as current crimes. And this violence and impunity stands as a concrete obstacle to women's ability to fully participate in post-conflict recovery. Equally, the inability and therefore shackles 50% of our resources and our capacity to rebuild our countries post-conflict. Equally, women's inability to access economic resources post-conflict can stand as an obstacle to accessing justice. We know in many contexts that the ability to travel long distances to courts to access the medical certificates or police records that might be needed to pursue a court case relies on the economic resources to be able to do this. And equally, that increased economic vulnerability can lead to physical vulnerability and a vulnerability to increased violence and insecurity for women. So when we are rebuilding justice sectors post-conflict, we need to place women's access to justice and women's specific needs with regards to access to justice at the center of our efforts for reform. And this was one of the findings of the mapping report that we undertook with UNDP last year. And I wanted to just give a little bit of context on the mapping report. In 2012, as part of the UN's own internal looking at rule of law institutions and programming, UN Women was requested to conduct a mapping report with UNDP, reviewing all of the UN's programming and funding in the area of women's access to justice in conflict settings. And the aim and intention of it was to look at what it is that we're achieving, where are the gaps and challenges, and how do we scale up our efforts and ensure that women's access to justice is at the heart of our rule of law response in conflict settings. Some of the key findings were that there has been much in development in this area in the past decade, and some of this has already been mentioned. The development of normative, of policy and programming in the area of justice for sexual and gender-based crimes, in particular in the past decade, has been enormous. There's also been an increase within the UN on joint programming efforts to secure justice for sexual violence and gender-based crimes. But what we found was that the response continues to be inadequate and not comprehensive in nature. The focus has often been on capacity building and the formal justice sector in particular, and in particular on the criminal justice system. There's been too little focus on informal justice mechanisms, on civil courts, on transitional justice, and on women's economic rights in particular. And this is despite a knowledge and acknowledgement of the need for a comprehensive response. And so this mapping report and the recommendations and the findings of it were used by UN Women and UNDP to inform a joint initiative and a joint program that was developed earlier this year, and that we are in part launching alongside the mapping report tonight. This joint initiative builds on past joint efforts between UNDP and UN Women in this area. But it scales up and ensures that this programming is more comprehensive in nature. The program includes support to transitional justice mechanisms, international and national prosecutions for past crimes, as well as justice sector reform, including institutional reforms, and a focus on building women's participation in the justice sector in post-conflict contexts. It also includes an engagement with informal or plural legal systems, recognizing that this is often the only sites of access to justice for women in post-conflict settings, and that there has been too little engagement with bringing these systems in line with human rights norms and women's access to justice. The joint initiative is in part premised on the principles of building on and leveraging the strengths of the two partners, UN Women and UNDP, and to further innovative programming that was started with the first phase of this program. And I want to just end by giving you two examples of this. And Anne-Marie mentioned the work that Erin has done with commissions of inquiry, the roster that we've created of sexual and gender crimes investigators that can be deployed to all UN commissions of inquiry, equally to the International Criminal Court, and increasingly now to national war crimes courts. And we're bringing these efforts together with the massive work that UNDP does on justice sector reform in post-conflict contexts to ensure that we have the targeted technical capacity and technical support with regards to investigations of sexual violence crimes, and mainstreaming this within the efforts for national justice sector reform post-conflict. Hitting on exactly as Karina mentioned earlier, the need to mainstream this work into all of our efforts. And the second example that I want to leave you with is an area of innovative programming that UN Women and UNDP began in 2010, which is in the area of reparations, development, and gender. And reparations is the justice mechanism that is perhaps the most victim-centered in focus, and it is the justice mechanism that is consistently prioritized by women in conflict settings, and yet it is also the justice mechanism that is the least supported, the least funded, and the least implemented in post-conflict contexts. Increasingly in the last few years, we've been seeing a growth in a recognition in policy as well as court judgments. And the ICC, the first reparations court order that was issued by the ICC last year in the Lubanga case talks specifically about the need for transformative reparations for women. And this is an area, there's an increasing recognition that reparations needs to be transformative and sustainable in nature, in particular for women. And the reason for this is that if we are not addressing the gender inequalities that render women vulnerable to these kinds of violations, but that also inform the consequences of these violations, that reparations will never have the reparative impact that we're seeking from this programming. And so by bringing together justice experts and justice practitioners with development practitioners, by creating the linkages between development and justice, and leveraging the mandates and the areas of work of UN Women and UNDP, we're seeking innovative programming in this area that can help us to further the policy on transformative reparations and transformative justice for women into a practical reality, and hope that through this program that we will be able to inform the work of states as well as international courts in this area. I want to end there and just mention that that this joint initiative and to follow as Karina has said already, that really our efforts are still hitting at the micro level, and that we really do need the support, the resources, obviously, but the partnerships. And also the innovative thinking and programming to ensure that we are scaling up and having the impact that we need to and securing justice for sexual and gender-based crimes. Thank you.
And again, as a little footnote, of those 18 peace agreements that did mention sexual violence, not one single one mentioned reparations, economic recovery, or development measures in relation to supporting women's capacity to recover and prevent further attacks. So thank you so much to our panel. We'd like to open now for questions. Please identify yourself and indicate who you're addressing your question to. And by all means, if you'd like also to share any innovations, please do. So is there a microphone handing out situation going on? Okay, so there's a gentleman next to you and a lady also at the back. Got you.
My name is Mohammed Ibrahim. I'm an Islamic law expert with Office of Rule of Law, DPKO. First of all, I would like to thank the panel for the presentations, and I would just make one comment regarding using or respecting actually the domestic legal system of the countries where we are working as international community will make a difference if we have a better understanding of the system. Most of the time we go there, we think that this system is dysfunctioning and it's not working, and most of the time it's yes, but because of lack of interpretation, the right interpretation, and because of the bad legal education and legal training. Not because the system is bad. I worked in Afghanistan, and there was an amnesty law there granting amnesty for a lot of warlords committing a lot of sexual violence and rape. And when the law passed, the UN opposed that because it against international standards. We were attacked because they're saying that we don't respect their culture. And this is a Western notion, and it's not a domestic one. So being an Islamic expert there, I said, well, in Sharia, based on the constitution of Afghanistan, it's unconstitutional because rape is considered violation of right of God, which is equivalent to international standards. And thus, this is considered unconstitutional. And according to that, actually, the President Karzai and I think the Council of Ulama there said this is right, and we cannot pass laws like that. So better understanding of domestic laws and giving ownership of the countries we're working will make better way of delivering what we are there for as international community. Thank you.
Thank you. The lady at the back, and then you, sir. Yes, we'll take a couple, and then we'll come back to the panel.
Thank you for the wonderful panel. My name is Salwa Kader. I am with the U.S. Federation for Middle East Peace and Development. I would like to address this question to Ms. Mensah. I just came back from a conference that I am part of in Arusha, Tanzania, for the International Women Judges. And I was very impressed with the Tanzanian president and his commitment to have so many magistrate and women judges. And it seems like there is a big trend in doing that, and they admit that they are far behind compared with the population. And so I would like to ask you, since you mentioned that, what would it take for countries to enhance the number of women magistrates and women judges? And my other question is for Ms. Gallagher. A couple of months ago, I was in Jordan, and I visited the refugees, the Syrian refugees, in Zaatari camp. And it was very horrible, really, really bad. But they don't talk about it. Even the UN does not talk about it. And I had an official visit. And UNHCR did not want to address the sexual abuse that the girls were having, and all this selling of girls and all of that problem. And they refused to address it. So I got my sources from the people themselves, not from the official, sources. And so what are you doing about that? How could you help them in a way? Because you had just said that they can go to certain places and talk about that. Where are these places? How could they get there? And what are you doing about it? Thank you.
Peter Bauk, working with the Norwegian Agency for Development Cooperation. The topic is sexual gender-based violence. And Irene, as the only one in the panel, mentioned that this actually also counts for men, that they are also victims. And I just wonder, are we, in our focus on this issue, actually, I mean, which is a very important issue and which is very, very difficult to raise because this is very sensitive in all kinds of societies, even in non-conflict societies. Are we forgetting an important element that actually this also happens against boys, not the least, and men? That we actually should get that also in the headlines and not, I mean, this is gender-based violence, which means both genders. Thank you.
Any other burning questions?
Gorgia Jama Eze, African Affairs Committee, the New York Bar Association. This question's for Madame Mensah. You spoke in terms of ex-combatant child soldiers. Could I ask you what exactly are you doing as regards female child soldiers, the reintegration back into society? I know that in an African society, it's very difficult to speak in terms of sexual violence. How are you reintegrating these former combatants back into society and also their children? You spoke in terms of the Domestic Violence Act. How are these affecting and impacting these ex-combatants, more specifically relating to the female child soldiers, and what are the rights of their children? Thank you.
Okay, so why don't we take the same order?
Right. Regarding female judges and female magistrates in Sierra Leone, I mentioned that we have 22 judges. Out of the 22 judges, there are 9 female judges, 3 in the Supreme Court, 4 in the Court of Appeal, and 2 in the High Court. And the Chief Justice is female. It is not easy to attract more women onto the bench for various reasons, but we make an effort to attract women. I mean, when we go out looking for judges, we try to tout women. Of the magistrates, we have 25, and we only have 4 female magistrates. In fact, we had 2 for a long time. It was only this month we've got 2 more. And again, efforts to get women to come on the bench are not yielding fruits for various reasons. But we actually encourage women to come on the bench. Regarding female combatants, I think there is a program by NACSA. What's NACSA? There's a program by government to integrate these child combatants, both male and female, into the society, including their children. There are various programs being run by NGOs, the government, and other civil society organizations to integrate them. But I don't have the statistics and the correct information on that aspect.
Thank you. Would you want to ask? Okay, so Erin? Yeah.
And I'll address your question about Zatari camp in particular. No, it's a very good point. All the ingredients are there. The women and the girls, the children are incredibly vulnerable. We don't quite know the scope of all that's happening, but certainly we're hearing the stories, right? It doesn't come so much from the camp, but from the people, the refugees living inside. Certainly there needs to be more support for the refugees, That's a baseline in all the neighboring countries, and in particular, Zatari is a very tragic camp to be living in. Certainly more media attention helps, but I think that's why the programming has to include all different types of violence that are affecting women and girls and refugees in the camps, whether that be domestic violence, sexual abuse, prostitution, trafficking, all the things that are happening inside the camp, that the programming has to be inclusive of all of that, which also includes ways for women to be able to support themselves better than they are, as well as the psychological support. So I'm hoping that more programming will help with that. I know there's gender coordinators assigned to UNHCR and to all the different organizations working inside. Obviously, it's not enough. So not an easy solution to a very hard question.
Sure. I actually just want to respond to the question about sexual and gender-based crimes against men, because I think it's a really important one that shouldn't go unanswered. And I think as UN Women, obviously, our focus is often on securing women's access to justice. And because of gender inequality, there are concrete and different obstacles to women's access to justice than there are for men. But I think specifically on the sexual and gender-based crimes, and Erin can speak to this much better than I can, but as UN Women, when we provide sexual violence investigators for courts and commissions of inquiry, they're there to investigate sexual and gender-based crimes against men and women. And in fact, as Erin will say, for both the Libya Commission of Inquiry and the Syria Commission of Inquiry, the first documented the first concrete patterns of sexual violence that were able to be verified were the use of sexual violence as a torture mechanism in detention centers, etc. And then, of course, as the conflict evolved, and much more came out about the use of sexual violence against women. But it is certainly a part of our work, and also a recognition that sexual violence perpetrated, whether against women or against men, is informed by the same notions of gender inequality and the use of gender-based violence, and so the responses in terms of seeking justice, exactly as you said, that we do need to look at what are the concrete obstacles for men and for women in seeking justice for these crimes.
If I could just I think in the ICTY, you would know better than me for sure, there were more convictions for sexual violence crimes against men than there were for women, which is a sign of men's social power, actually. And so it's one sign of how they're able to mobilize social resources, legal resources, perhaps somewhat better than women because of gender relations. That's not to minimize this in any way. It is a very important feature of the whole situation, and indeed it does deserve to be considered, on these kinds of panels. Men and women are affected differently by this and can deal with it differently, which I think reinforces the point that Nala was making about reparations having to be about transformation in gender relations. So that sexual relations and gender relations can't be used to trigger these kinds of attacks or to shape the way people suffer from them afterwards. Nobody answered the question on national law. From the initial speaker, it wasn't really a question, it was a comment. But I think, Louise Arbour once commented that there is not a single legal system anywhere in the world, formal or informal, that sanctions sexual violence when properly interpreted. And indeed, it's extremely important to relate to and to ground this also in systems that are seen as locally legitimate. And finally, on the question on judges, women judges and magistrates, I would love to see this come out as a target of the post-2015 framework, increasing the number of women judges, magistrates, and police around the world as a conflict prevention mechanism, because I think it would actually support the kinds of outcomes and also the kinds of innovation that you're talking about. Any other questions? We are going to be pausing shortly to hand over to Mr. Jordan Ryan for the final remarks. But are there any other questions or comments? Or yes, please, 2 in a row, right there. That's wonderful. A mic is coming. Please do introduce yourself.
Okay, thank you very much for this panel. It's very interesting tonight. I am Nicole Taylor. I am the program director with the International Legal Foundation, which is based here in New York. We essentially are an international NGO. We provide, we try to increase access to justice by ensuring access to counsel to indigent accused, including women and children. In January of 2014, in Afghanistan, where we have an office, we represented a 16-year-old girl who was abducted from her home and raped. And when she was located, she was then charged with running away from her home. So she was essentially victimized twice. And when we finally were able to make contact with her, you can imagine that it was very hard to talk to her. She wouldn't open up to our male lawyer. And so in response to situations like this, we have situations like this in Palestine where we have offices, as well as Nepal. We started the WILL program, which is Women in Law and Leadership, which essentially works internally to increase our female lawyers' ability to identify these types of issues that happen in the community. And we also kind of deploy our female lawyers into the justice sector to work with organizations like UN Women to increase the opportunities for female lawyers in general to have access to training, et cetera, in order to be better prepared to represent females who are detained. I guess so my question is kind of what is being done in situations where females are kind of, victimized and then victimized again when they are come into the system, and then what is also being done, and I think my question would be targeted directly to Ms. Valji, to increase the participation of female lawyers in general in the justice community.
Yeah. Caroline Tissot from Switzerland. I had a question related to our discussion this afternoon, actually, on the review done by UNDP of mobile courts. And on the Congo, and that's a question I'd addressed to Madame Mensah. Actually, on the Congo, one of the conclusions on the Congo experience is that focusing so much on sexual gender-based violence has somehow led to a two-tier type of justice. And I found interesting to have your feedback for your country, or if this is a risk. Sorry? Yeah, so the conclusion of that evaluation says that the risk is to have a two-tier justice system that is actually providing much better attention to victims of sexual violence than to victims of other type of crime. So it was just to know if this is an issue or if it's very specific to Congo. And I had another comment on the sexual violence against men. I think we really need to look at the special circumstances and the context, because in the case of the former Yugoslavia, the men were, the vast majority of detained persons were men. And that's where they were actually vulnerable to sexual violence rather than just being the man around in freedom. So this is an issue that maybe contextually need to be looked at. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Katrina. I'm with the Office of the Special Representative on Sexual Violence in Conflict. And I'm wondering, in post-conflict societies, when so many of the organs of civil society have been damaged, or they are, in a lot of cases, incapable of being able to help survivors of sexual violence, international courts step forward in a lot of these instances to help grow local capacity and deliver some semblance of justice if civil society or the national government can't do it itself. And I'm curious as to how these international structures are viewed in the local community, and if there are any hard policy strategies to try to grow local ownership in this issue, and if local ownership could help stimulate a cultural change that maybe would be more resistant to rape and sexual violence in the future. Thanks so much. What's your last name?
If I understand your question well, you say there's two-tier, the lady behind you, there's two-tier justice system, one for gender-based and one for the normal system. Is that what you were asking? Oh.
Because that's a priority, so
Yes.
it's receiving cover more. And as you have mentioned, you have very little resources. So I was wondering if this is also an issue for you in your country.
Okay. Well, sexual violence cases are receiving more attention because of the nature of the problem. Because we do find out that this is hurting the system, the justice system. It's hurting the economy, and it's being perpetrated against people who are less able to defend themselves, who do not talk, and the damage is far outreaching. And the reason we have a special program is because initially everybody is having a program on justice and rule of law generally, and there's nothing about gender-based violence. And so that's why we started this program, not because the other system is not receiving attention. Previously, everybody was putting its efforts on general justice system and rule of law, and this was neglected. And as I say, it is suffered by people who could not talk for themselves, and it is undermining the system. So it's not because the GBVs are getting more attention than any other part of the system. We're just fast-tracking it now because of the reasons which I have stated.
Do you want to comment at all on how international structures are viewed locally?
International structures, which international structures are you talking about?
Like Sierra Leone Special Court, how is it viewed locally?
The Sierra Leone Special Court, well, there are varying opinions about the Special Court for Sierra Leone, but I'm happy that there's a good legacy from the court. It has improved our jurisprudence. We have taken over some of their structures from the legacy program. The residual court is also comprising Sierra Leone judges. So we are not viewing the Special Court for Sierra Leone as something foreign. It's something which the government has taken ownership of, because the Special Court for Sierra Leone was by an agreement between the government of Sierra Leone and the United Nations. It's the first one of its kind. So it's not a foreign one, but we are benefiting from the legacy and the residual issues of the court.
It's a good model. Yeah.
Yes, it's a good model.
Can I, yes, please?
I would also like to comment on the two-tier approach in Congo. I think that case shows if you're just focusing on combating sexual violence, legal aid to women, training judges on how to deal with such cases, but you neglect the general system as has been done in Congo, you don't get anywhere. If the judges and all the personnel in the courts don't have the basic skills, if they don't know how to manage their cases or whatever, then all the other trainings, specifically for SGBV, is not effective. And that's why I was trying to convince you, let's look at the overall programs and make progress there. One of the Usalama researchers in the Kivus, she came with this story. There was this man attacked, bleeding to death. He had to be transported to hospital. There was an NGO with a car who couldn't take him to hospital because this car was only for rape victims. You get crazy, crazy situations. If you just have these standalone, separate projects, this really happened. So we need to put whatever we are doing to fight SGBV in the context of the general systems. The general systems, they have to work. The reproductive health system have to work. The rule of law in general has to work. And then all these projects, they will fall into place. So we should be very careful with too much emphasizing the standalone projects.
Actually, if I could address the question about how the international courts are viewed by local communities, it's been quite varied in my experience. It has to do with the international politics, who's involved, what stage the conflict is in. In Libya, the ICC had already started a preliminary investigation. There had already been quite a bit of media attention of ICC's potential work there, and there was great hope that the ICC would be the answer to the conflict, and in particular sexual violence in Libya. In Syria, that's not been the same case. They're just partly because there has been a feeling of abandonment by the international community by Syrians. So there is not that same. There's much more distance and lack of trust that an international court will respond to the needs. So we're not seeing the same hope, well, for other obvious reasons too that happened recently, that an international court will be a solution at all to the Syria crisis.
Nala, 30 seconds. Okay, well, we don't have time for any more questions because we're going to hand over now to Mr. Ryan, who will need a microphone. Before we do, though, I'd like to sincerely thank all of you for coming and for your commitment, especially after a long day at work, when you could be at home feeding your kids or catching up on email. So really, the commitment of the international community on this issue has been extraordinary around the world, and I know many of you will be in London in a couple of weeks at the UK's summit on sexual violence in conflict. I'd also quickly like to thank crucial people who organized the event. Norul Rashid, back there, you can wave. Alison Davidian, wave. And Alejandro, are you here? Yeah. Yes, fantastic. So Alejandro Alvarez, thank you so much for putting the event together. And with that's no further ado, if Mr. Ryan could just make a few closing remarks.
Thank you very much. Well, first to Marianne and IPI, and just extraordinary what IPI does, and just very grateful for the opportunity to have this extraordinary panel assembled. And Anne-Marie, we're very pleased that you have had an opportunity to get out of academia for the evening to bring the group together and be a master at moderating the discussion. But Madam Mensah, thank you for not only speaking this morning, but as you said, and we know, bringing that a voice from the field and just keeping at it. The work that you've done in Sierra Leone, and that fact that that tribal chief has felt a little bit of accountability when he and that minister probably thought, hey, we're going to get away with this. Nobody's ever felt accountability before. Karina, we hear you. I get sick every time I read a UNDP report and it says, yeah, we helped 250 victims. I mean, I just say, why isn't that 250,000, or why isn't it 20 million? I just, it just pains me that, we haven't been able to scale up when the problem is so enormous. And I was glad that Ms. Mensah talked a little bit about that today, that we're failing every single day, but every single day there's a little bit more about national authorities, brave women and men that are actually doing a little bit more to get the word out and trying to make it more robust. But clearly we're not done enough at all, and that day in 2009 in Liberia, when we should have been very proud, the International Colloquium was meeting on a Saturday and Sunday, and I was there, and everyone was happy and excited about women around the world and men around the world coming to Liberia. And that very morning, I went to a meeting in the Samuel Doe Conference Center, and there was a woman who said, my granddaughter, I invited her to come here, and she's 10 years old, and I was so happy that she was going to see women from around the world come here. And while she was visiting me this past week here in Monrovia, my 10-year-old granddaughter was raped. And that war was ended, but as you said, that war was worse for women and girls because we hadn't done enough. There were peacekeepers there. There were UN soldiers there. There was a woman president there. and not enough had been done to have that transformative agenda that changed the dynamics. And to hear you, Erin, speak about how we approach as sort of the international community, women and girls and yes, men that have been violated by war and violence, and some would say that rape is the least of my worries because my family's been torn asunder. I've been bombed. My child is dead. My whole community has been torn asunder. My life is ruined. I know nothing of where I can live or how I'm going to survive. And time after time in Liberia, I'd hear there was no psychosocial support available. It was the lowest priority. It wasn't going to be given to them because we had 3 days of psychosocial support, and then it was time not to continue that. And I think you said so well, if we don't start with finding ways to be there for the long term, if we don't find ways of knowing it's listening to in a way that's not that we know better than they, because they're the ones that have suffered. We should be as humble as we can be to provide anything we can do to support them to have all the dignity they deserve as a human being, and that we deserve we owe them that dignity that they should have as humans, and that everything we can do as the international community to provide that in both crisis-affected and fragile states. And I'm so glad, quite frankly, that UN Women and UNDP have found ways, I think, over time to work better together, and that we've had collaboration that's not just words, but actually we've got colleagues that work really hard together, despite sometimes flags waving, getting in their ways, because the colleagues on the ground know what's right to do. The colleagues that every day see what the UN should be, of helping people that have suffered so much and deserve a UN that works, and to make the system work better. And to know that we now have relaunched this and have lessons that come out of this mapping, and that our joint global initiative has the thinking that can make a better reality on the ground. And it is all about that support and empowerment to victims, and in fact, that word victim is not who they are. It's in support and empowerment to some of the strongest people that exist in our world. Women, men, children who have had the most awful existence thrown at them. They have felt the hot metal of guns and bullets that make fortunes for our countries that still sell those weapons to them. They have been raped by the men who still enjoy impunity and have yet to feel those jail sentences that they deserve. And they are the ones in places like South Sudan that are exposed to the complete chaos that comes from political leaders who ignore the needs of the people of a country and allow war to break out. So I applaud each of you for what you've done here this evening in terms of, I think, with your passion and words and hard work, show how much has been done and give us that challenge by identifying the challenges that remain to know that by working together, we can do so much more. So again, with deep gratitude to IPI that makes forums like this available, to UN Women, to colleagues in UNDP, to our donors who work hard, and especially to our colleagues who work at the national and local level, NGOs and actors who go into places that are very difficult to work in. I want to thank you, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jordan, for those extremely moving remarks, and thank you all very much. Please take a moment to have a glass of wine, and I'm going to give Jordan a hug. So thank you.